Greetings, everyone, from the APEC Secretariat, and thank you, Denis Hugh, for joining us from Singapore. Let's get started by talking about the pandemic and its effects on the global economy. Denis, what are the economic prospects for the APEC region over the next few years?
Hi, Michael. I'm glad to join the discussion on this very important topic. Well, the economic prospects for the APEC region is looking pretty pessimistic this year. We've seen lockdowns being imposed in different parts of the world, and these lockdowns has resulted in significant reductions in industrial production as well as in private consumption. The IMF has recently revised their forecast downwards to 4.9%. So they're looking at a global economic contraction of that of 4.9%. And they explain that this contraction is due to a larger than expected hit on global economic activities as well as persistent social distancing, which also has an impact on businesses as well as consumer spending. In line with the IMF forecast, we're looking at a contraction for the region of 3.7%, which translates to an output loss of about 2.9 trillion US dollars. The IMF is looking at a global recovery next year of about 5.4%, and we are looking at about 5.7% recovery in the APEC region in 2021. Global economic contraction is also reflected in trade performance. The World Trade Organization has forecast a contraction in world trade ranging between minus 13% to about minus 32%. Similarly, we'll be expecting contractions also in imports and exports in the APEC region this year. So moving forward, growth projections will either improve or deteriorate. It all depends on the containment of the COVID-19 pandemic and how effective various different policies have been implemented to address this pandemic.
How has the pandemic disrupted supply chains? At the APEC level, what can member economies do to keep supply chains open and build more resilience into the system?
The lockdown has led to factories being shut. We've seen shortages in manpower, restrictions in movement of people, transport links, logistic links all being badly affected. And all this has led to significant disruptions in global supply chains. Particularly in the manufacturing sector, we've seen industries in telecommunications, in automobiles, in precision engineering, all being very badly affected by these disruptions in supply chains. UNCTAD itself has forecast that FDI global flows will drop in 2020 to 2021 by a range of 30 to 40% because of these production stoppages as well as supply chain disruptions. So what can we do to mitigate some of these supply chain disruptions? Well, global supply chains are designed for the long term, so they're not very good in addressing these sort of black swan events like the COVID-19 pandemic. But what we can look at, it's quite a specialized field, is supply chain risk management. We can look at, for example, extensive supply chain mapping, looking at first tier, second tier suppliers, looking for backup suppliers in case we have these kind of supply chain shocks. We can also have a relook at manufacturing techniques, just-in-time manufacturing techniques, which is widely adopted. It's very good in minimizing costs, but it does lead to acute inventory shortages, particularly in times when you have when you have these kinds of supply chain shocks. What can APEC do? APEC has a long and good track record in supply chain connectivity and addressing some of these supply chain bottlenecks. It's currently going through its second phase of its supply chain connectivity framework action plan. So I think it's really a matter of refocusing or reprioritizing some existing measures, looking at trade facilitation, transport facilitation, but within the context of some of the challenges that's arisen because of this pandemic.
With more and more people out of work and food processing facilities at high risk, what are the implications for food security?
Well, it's equally devastating if we see disruptions in the food sector supply chains as well, and that in the worst case scenario can lead to a food crisis. We've seen, for example, panic buying in supermarkets on particularly food staples like rice, and governments in some economies have reacted by imposing export bans on certain types of food, as well as or trade restrictions on these types of food staples. Now, the combination of supply restrictions as well as overwhelming demand can lead to an escalation of food prices and could destabilize the economy. The PSU did a policy brief on food security recently, and we found that thankfully that these types of trade restrictions on food products are not very high in the APEC region. But we still need to be vigilant to ensure that there's no escalation in these types of measures that could lead to a deterioration in the food security situation in APEC. So what can APEC do on the food security front? Well, one of the things that we can do is to consider is to reduce tariffs and different types of restrictions on particularly essential food products. For example, New Zealand and Singapore have signed a declaration on trade in essential goods to combat the COVID-19 pandemic on the 15th of April this year. And that involves eliminating custom duties and not impose any kinds of restrictions on about 124 essential goods. That includes both medical and food products.
We've seen the impact on several industries, including tourism, aviation, and travel. Do you see these sectors recovering soon?
These sectors are perhaps one of the most affected by the pandemic. Let's look at the tourism industry. It's big business. It's close to 10% of global GDP. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council, just 3 months of stoppages in global travel could translate to something like a loss in 50 million jobs, of which I would say 60% of them are derived from Asia. If we also look at the APEC region itself, the tourism and hospitality sector contributes something like 2.9% of GDP as well as 3.8% of employment. Uh, According to the World Economic Forum as well, we've seen all these travel bans and flight cancellation has led to a loss in the airline industry of something to the likes of about 880 billion US dollars. And those estimates by the World Economic Forum were taken sometime in mid-March. We know that since then, there's still been many economies who do have many of these types of travel restrictions in place, so these numbers would certainly be a lot larger.
How about small businesses and the vulnerable segments of society? What can APEC do to support these areas?
Micro, small, medium enterprises are perhaps one of the most vulnerable to economic shocks like this pandemic. This is because they tend to have less assets, less capital compared to larger companies. Yet they are one of the largest employers in the region. On average, they contribute something like 60% of total employment, and in some economies up to 90%. At the APEC level itself, APEC has been implementing many initiatives to support micro, small, medium enterprises. For example, we have the 2015 Boracay Action Agenda to globalize micro, small, medium enterprises. We also have a very active SME working group that tries to address many of the different types of economic challenges that are being faced by small businesses. We also have the APEC Economic Committee that is currently in its final year of implementation of its structural reform strategy. It's called the Renewed APEC Agenda on Structural Reforms, or RAZOR for short. And that includes examining structural reform measures that would deepen economic participation, particularly among the most vulnerable segments of society. This include women, people with disabilities, the youth, even including micro, small, medium enterprises, as well as others. And for many years now, as part of APEC host economy priorities, they've been including different types of priorities that covers economic, financial, as well as social inclusion. There's also been renewed efforts in women economic empowerment, particularly in linking them with inclusive policies. Sadly, pre-existing inequalities as well as income gaps that we see in the region may be further exacerbated by this pandemic. So therefore, there's a need to step up on efforts to promote more inclusive policies. We have the 2017 Action Agenda to advance economic, social, and financial inclusion. This was launched in 2017 when Vietnam hosted APEC, and perhaps there's a need to find ways to accelerate many of these different types of inclusive policies as we move forward.
Let's talk about the new normal. What will it look like, and what role do you see for technology?
Certainly in the short term, we'll continue to see social distancing being adopted by many, as well as face masks being worn, particularly in crowded places. In terms of the applications of digital technologies, well, we begin to see that digital technologies as well as the digital economy in general has come to fore during these lockdown periods. We've seen applications such as Zoom or Skype for workplace arrangements for those particularly who have been working at home. It's also useful for students for online lectures or distance learnings. But looking forward, as many companies begin to go back to business, we might see greater investments in automation as well as artificial intelligence or industrial robots as a way to try to mitigate some of the risks, particularly in supply chains. I talked about a little bit about that earlier in terms of supply chain disruptions. And of course, these have some concerns in terms of implications on human resource development, as they could lead to greater job displacements or rising concerns of job insecurity. So this is something to look out for, particularly in the medium to long term.
What can be done at the regional level to address this pandemic, and what collective action could be taken to mitigate risks in the future?
At the individual economy level, we've seen governments digging deep to find the necessary resources to support households as well as businesses, essentially doing whatever it takes to address some of the adverse economic impact of this pandemic. At the regional level, on the 5th of May this year, the APEC ministers responsible for trade have directed senior officials to develop a strategy to collect as well to share important information and policy measures and actions to address some of the adverse consequences of this pandemic. APEC itself can also consider a region-wide pandemic preparedness policy toolkit that would cover policy options and other types of information to avoid a future pandemic. And this can be complemented as well by a health database that will provide relevant data on healthcare capacity, for example. Also, APEC, as we move forward, may wish to also consider the elimination of tariffs on essential medical goods, particularly those which are critical for healthcare workers during this pandemic. This can include face masks, hand sanitizers, as well as protective equipment. Sector-specific tariff reductions is not new for APEC. We had the groundbreaking environmental goods list back in 2012. So APEC economies may wish to consider the phase elimination, the reduction as well as elimination of tariffs on essential medical goods in the future.
Thanks, Denis, for sharing your views. For more information, please visit www.apec.org. Here you can find the APEC Regional Trends Analysis, which examines the near-term outlook, risks, and opportunities. We encourage you to visit us on our social media platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. To request an interview, please contact us at media@apec.org. Together, we can advance free trade for Asia-Pacific prosperity.